All institutions need justification. They have to justify their existence, and this has everything to do with legitimacy. Right? Do we believe that this institution has a legitimate, right and place in society for us to want to play the roles that it requires us to play for its own survival, so that it can, hopefully solve some kind of important societal need, right? So think of many of the institutions that exist in our society. When the institution is strong and really helping solve a need, we tend not to question it, right? We take it for granted. We act like it's maybe even the only natural way that society could function. Of course, kids are going to go to school. Of course, someday we're going to get married. Or, of course, I need to go get a career at a company, right? So there's ideas that many people will never even question because the institutional legitimacy for the role that institution plays and the roles it demands us to play for it are secure, right? Now, if you've ever been around small children for any length of time, you'll know that their very favorite question to ask is why. Right? Why do I have to go to bed? Why do I have to eat my vegetables? Why do I have to go to school? They are still being socialized in learning to participate in institutions, and they don't see the reason why. Right? So every new generation has to teach the kids why we do the things we do, why the institutions that we are a part of are important. And of course, over time, institutions may become less relevant. Right? Maybe they're no longer solving the need that they once had, and then people will start to question, especially the next generation. Right? So back to the example of a community of people on a deserted island, and they're building a new society. And let's say they're struggling to find food. They're not particularly skilled at fishing or harvesting crops, growing the indigenous plants, and they're starving. And all of a sudden, this, we'll say, big flock of pigeons migrates to the island, and they're able to capture some of them. Some people are a little better at that than others, and they survive, right? And so the people who are better at capturing these pigeons and saving the little community are celebrated. And they realize that this migration is going to happen at a certain time or times every year, and they start to center their society around it. So the pigeon becomes this symbolic, icon of their society. Maybe they worship a kind of pigeon deity. They decorate their clothes and lots of their artifacts and items with pigeon feathers and bones and beaks and what have you. And maybe they even start to give titles to people who are really good at hunting the pigeons or learning about their habitats or predicting when the migration will happen. And those people gain status in society and maybe even leadership roles. And so this sort of clan or maybe religion of the pigeon has this really powerful place in society. And you could imagine over generations that builds up and people get that it solves a need. It's important to know about the pigeons. They're the primary source of food. It's important to know how to catch the pigeons. We need to train people into these roles. There's status to be gained if you're good at it. So people start to desire to play these roles. But then all of a sudden, the pigeons don't come back. Maybe they're over-harvested or their migration, their inner compass changes. But for whatever reason, they don't come back. Now, there's a lot of people with a vested interest in keeping the pigeon religion and leadership structure in place because it benefits them, because they're the leaders. They're higher on the status hierarchy. But the kids are going to start asking why. Why do I have to go learn how to hunt pigeons? I've never even seen a pigeon in my life, right? Why do we decorate with all these pigeon things? They're not around, right? And so this question of why will start to set in. Now, maybe there's a latent function that this pigeon religion and leadership structure can solve because it brings order to the society. And maybe it doesn't really matter if there's not pigeons anymore because they've learned how to fish at this point or cultivate crops. But nevertheless, the task of legitimation, right, of convincing the next generation that this institution is still important and that they should want to play a role in the institution, it gets harder. Especially if there's now a disconnect from the manifest or stated purpose or problem that this institution is solving, and then what they see. And so all institutions face this. And the more effectively they're able to justify their existence, And if they're able to do it so well other than the children asking why, that as you get older, you stop asking why, you just take it for granted. Well, then that institution's probably going to be around for generations to come. But when that question why, starts to become harder and harder to answer, then people a little older than just kids also start continuing to ask, wait, why are we doing this? Why is this important again? And that starts to bring the institutional legitimacy into question, right? That institution is now under threat. Peter Berger and Thomas Leckman say that there's 4 main layers of legitimation that any institution has to go through to try and justify itself. So that at the first layer are just these really simple answers, symbols. So in this pigeon society, the kids, maybe at the lower grades or whatever, they're called little pigeons, and they wear pigeon clothing, and so it's just, why do we have to learn about pigeons? And the parents say, oh, because we said so. It makes the great pigeon happy, or, whatever, if they're the pigeon deity or something. And that's usually sufficient up to a certain age, right? But then people need a little bit more sophisticated justification. So we move into the second layer, and that's where there has to be some basic theoretical or basic argumentation that makes sense for why this is important. Right? Well, don't you want to be a good leader, and don't you want to help the society? So you need to know about pigeons. And they're like, we've never seen a pigeon. They're not around. And they're like, well, they're going to come back, and if you got to be ready, maybe they retell the story of how the pigeons saved them in the beginning of the founding of the group. But they have to argue for why this is important, and that will suffice for a while as well, or at least to many, or perhaps most in the society. Then the third layer of legitimation is where you need really expert reasons. And once you need a really specialized knowledge to defend the legitimacy of the institution, you also need specialized personnel. So at layer 3, there are now full-time workers whose job is to develop and hone and teach, what have you, this specialized knowledge, right? So this might be in religion, this might be the theologians. In science, it's the research scientists. But this is the level where you need sophisticated theoretical knowledge to promote the institution. And then lastly, the fourth layer is what we call the symbolic universe. And that is where the institution has become so entrenched in society that it integrates with the other pillar institutions to create the symbolic universe, the kind of worldview canopy for that society. Right? So if you take all the main institutions that have reached the highest layer of legitimation, at the symbolic universe layer level, they start to, they accommodate one another. They make room for one another. Right, so think of an institution in our society that is not quite at that level. Maybe certain new kinds of sports or something. We'll say like video games or pickleball or something. Right, they're not fully legitimized as these huge pillars, institutional pillars of our society. Right, so there's not a big symbolic universe for them. Right, as opposed to another institution that has reached this level. We could say marriage, for example. Well, when you look at the other pillars, is there room for marriage in them? Right, so take government. That's a high, definitely with the highest layer of legitimation. Does government recognize marriage? Yeah, you go to the courthouse, you get married. They'll give you, there's different rules on your taxes. Take our medical system, they'll give different visiting rights to spouses, or our military will treat spouses in a certain way. So the pillar institutions recognize each other. But, does the government recognize pickleball players? You don't get a tax break for doing that, right? Or esports doesn't mean you have different visiting hours because you're a champion at playing esports, right? So these institutions don't all reach that level. There may not be full-time professionals advancing knowledge of esports. Maybe there are, I don't know. But this speaks to these layers of legitimation, right? The ones that are high at the highest layer, we know that there's experts. We can name who those experts are. And we know that the other institutions recognize them as legitimate in the society. And so just as an institution has to go through these layers to justify its existence, it can also, when its authority, when its legitimacy is drawn into question, it can start to delegitimate. It can sort of have these layers unravel. right? So take a certain religion that people are not really practicing anymore. People don't want to play the role of adherent to this certain religion. And this has happened. There's many religions throughout history that no longer exist, right? And you could imagine a society built around that religion, right? It's this pigeon religion or something in our example. The pigeons stop coming. Now people don't really want to participate. Less people then want to become the ministers of this, the theologians of this, right? The expert personnel. Well, then that third layer starts to fall apart, right? And so you can see how this can unravel for an institution. And, there still may be needs it's meeting, but if it's not the stated need, it's some latent need, there may be new institutions that come along that then try to meet that need better. And there will be maybe a transition period where there's institutional competition between these competing institutions for that role in social life. But ultimately, if institution A can't defend itself, can't get the next generation to get on board and believe in it and buy on, it will fail. It will die. Institutions do have life cycles.